Good Monday morning to you. It's great to be here with you for Matthew study number 72. I can't think of a better way to begin the work week than to be in the Word of God together. I just again thank you for sharing a little bit of your life experience with me as we work our way through Matthew's Gospel. This morning we want to continue the look at the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and we find this in Matthew chapter 5, and we want to continue for the last time our discussion of this third Beatitude. It means so much, so many things. That's why we really need to explore it a little bit. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, as we talked about it yesterday, that would be Saturday, this idea of meekness really carries with it, at least in the Greek language, a bit of a complexity. On the one hand, there is this sense of not too much anger, not no anger, but just kind of the right amount. There is also this idea of this inner strength that comes and this self-control that comes to know how to use one's strength. The Greeks had this concept of it being a self-controlled, but certainly the way that Jesus is talking about it really means to be God-controlled, similar to the way a domesticated animal might bend his or her own will to that of his master. We now today come to this kind of third concept of meekness that I'd like to talk to you about. Oftentimes in the Greek language, this word pros or preotes, depending on which way you use it, would be translated opposite of another Greek word called hupsolokardia. Cardia, of course, being the word for heart. We still have that today, cardiac. This hupsolokardia would be this idea of a lofty heartedness, kind of being full of oneself. And so this is why many of the translations, as we saw in the middle part of last week, will translate this word for meekness also as someone who is humble or someone who is filled with humility. It describes a man's proper attitude towards God. So a third translation of this beatitude could be, "Blessed is the man who has the humility to know his own ignorance, his own weakness, and his own need." And honestly, I think that probably comes about as close to what Jesus might have been meaning as anything else, certainly in the context of him talking about blessed is the one who is poor in spirit, blessed is the one who is filled with mourning. In this kind of a meekness, Jesus, notice this, Jesus promises that this truly humble man, this man who is filled with control, will inherit the earth. Now, we look at other great men of the earth, great leaders, both in biblical times as well as in our history books, and we find that men who had this sense of meekness, who had this idea of great strength under control, made great leaders. In the Bible, we certainly don't think of Moses as, we do think of him as being a great leader, a great lawgiver, but possibly in some ways the greatest man who ever lived. Numbers says of Moses, "Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the men that were on the face of the earth," that being in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Now, anyone who reads the Pentateuch would understand that this Moses was not a milquetoast kind of guy. He was no spineless creature. He could be at times blazingly angry, but he was a man whose anger was on a leash. He was a man who was controlled, and his anger and his strength would only be released at the right time for the right reason. Now, let's contrast that with another person who was a great leader, but who obviously at times was not someone who was very meek. In fact, his very name was known as Alexander, not the meek, but Alexander the Great. Well, at a time when he was drunk and in a fit of uncontrolled temper, hurled a spear and killed his very best friend. You see, a man who has not learned to master himself or submit himself to God and God's strength and God's control is not someone who is going to be meek. And thus, Jesus, to put it into the negative, would not inherit the earth. Jesus is saying that this person with this quiet, inner, controlled strength will inherit the earth. So, with all due respect for Charles Barkley, who has helped me with this understanding of meekness, let's look at this kind of expanded threefold idea of meekness as we find it in Matthew 5:5. Oh, the bliss of the man who is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time, who has every instinct and impulse and passion under control because he himself is God-controlled, who has the humility to realize his own ignorance and his own weakness, for such a man is king among men. This is probably the very best definition and description of the simple words of the human God, carpenter, teacher, Jesus, who simply said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Thanks for joining me this Monday, and I look forward to talking to you again tomorrow on Tuesday.